Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about some of the biggest data breaches that made the headlines in the past few years and kind of go into the security and privacy issues that happened with these breaches. So before I introduce the three breaches I'm going to be talking about today and talk about what happened with them and how they could have been prevented, I'm going to give a basic definition of what a data breach is so the groundwork is there and we can understand why exactly these are considered data breaches. So according to George W. Reynolds, a data breach is the unintended release of sensitive data or the access of sensitive data by unauthorized individuals. So this just basically means somebody who shouldn't have access to that information gets access to that information and could be using it for bad things. We don't really know what they could be doing with it. The first data breach that I'm going to be discussing in today's video is the DoorDash data breach. So in 2019, the food delivery service DoorDash announced that a data breach had occurred within their systems. And according to an article posted on the website TechCrunch.com, about 4.9 million customers, delivery workers, and merchants were affected by this breach. So the customers had their name, email, delivery address, order history, and password stolen, which seems a little scary that much of their personal information had gotten out. But what was even scarier was the fact that around 100,000 DoorDash delivery drivers had their driver's license information stolen in the breach, which who knows what these hackers were doing with the information they got. Why did they want to steal driver's license information? We may never really know what they did because DoorDash shut it down after it was discovered. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about DoorDash's response, or more lack of a response, because more than a year before the breach occurred, customers had been complaining to DoorDash that their accounts were being hacked and that unauthorized people were trying to gain access to them. But DoorDash assured users that the hackers were running a credential stuffing attack, which, according to an article posted to Wired's website, credential stuffing is when attackers take a massive trove of usernames and passwords and try to stuff these credentials in the login page of other digital services. So it basically meant that the hackers were taking the usernames and passwords from other websites and trying to stuff them into DoorDash to get access to the data, when in actuality, that's not what was happening. That TechCrunch article I mentioned earlier also talked about the fact that the customers had told DoorDash that they use different usernames and passwords for DoorDash than they had for other websites, so how would the credential stuffing make sense in this situation? So in the case of this attack, DoorDash responded way too late because they were convinced it was just a credential stuffing attack and that nothing was wrong. And you have to think, if maybe they'd intervened earlier, less people could have been involved in the breach and it could have been more easily handled. Now I want to talk a little bit about how group power played a role in the DoorDash breach. So Peter Morris discusses the fact that a big part of group power is the group interest, and this relates directly to this breach because DoorDash felt it was best to keep the idea that a potential breach may have occurred under wraps to protect the company and protect their image. Because let's face it, companies don't look very good when they have to announce there was a data breach and millions of users' information was stolen and they don't know where it is or what it's being used for. So DoorDash felt that they should just let the issue continue and that it would go away and it wasn't really a data breach, it was just a credential stuffing attempt. But they waited too long and they eventually had to admit that there was in fact a breach. And then they had to tell all these users about what had been stolen and that they needed to change their usernames and passwords to try to prevent more information from getting out. And really, the company let the privacy of their users be violated because they wanted to preserve their own image. They didn't want to look bad, so they sacrificed customer privacy in order to protect themselves, basically, and try to avoid being in the news for having a breach. Now I'm going to introduce the second major breach I'll be talking about in this video, and that was the Capital One data breach. So in March 2019, Capital One the banking company, announced that a data breach had occurred. And according to an article found in the New York Times, the breach affected more than 100 million Capital One customers. And the information that the hackers stole was 140,000 social security numbers and 80,000 bank account numbers. And then, in addition to social security numbers and bank numbers, tens of millions of credit card applications were stolen. This was a huge breach that Capital One had to immediately respond to because of its severity. So, unlike the DoorDash data breach, we actually know who hacked Capital One and caused that data breach. And that person was a woman by the name of Paige Thompson. And she had formerly worked at Amazon Web Services. This is really important because Amazon Web Services is what houses the Capital One database that she hacked and got information from. And what I find the strangest part of this is she was not very quiet about what she was doing. She bragged about her hacking online, and that's actually what ended up getting her caught. The FBI saw her online, and that's what led to the breach being found out and quickly resolved. Now I'm going to take a little pause on talking about the breach for just a second to give a definition of what a firewall is, because a firewall is what played a huge role in what happened in this breach. So according to Joseph Kiza, a firewall is a hardware or software used to isolate the sensitive portions of information system facility from the outside world and limit potential damage that can be done via malicious intruder. So this is basically what protects the data, and this is kind of what went wrong in the case of Capital One. As I mentioned in the firewall slide, what went wrong in the Capital One data breach was essentially something wrong with their firewall. So, according to the New York Times article that I talked about earlier, Amazon Web Services hosts the remote data servers that companies use to store their information, but large enterprises like Capital One build their own web applications on top of Amazon's cloud data so they can use the information in ways specific to their needs, which basically means they add their own web application and their own security so they can get access to the information quicker and easier. But this turned out to be a downfall in this situation because there was something wrong with the firewall on Capital One's web application, which led to Miss Thompson being able to hack the information and get in and take whatever she wanted, which was horrible. Before we talk about the last data breach that I'm going to discuss in this video, we need to talk a little bit about encryption because encryption plays a huge role in this breach. So according to Joseph Miga Kiza, encryption is a method that protects the communication channel from sniffers. So it's basically the security that tries to keep people out and keep the data safe. And there are two main types of encryption. There's symmetrical encryption and asymmetrical encryption. And symmetrical encryption uses a common key in the same algorithm to scramble and unscramble the messages. So it's a little easier to kind of use and get into. But asymmetrical encryption uses two different keys, a public key that everybody knows, but then there's also a private key that's only known by the sender and the receiver. So it helps add an extra layer of protection to the information between the sender and the receiver. And this ended up playing a huge role in the next data breach. The third and final data breach I'm going to be discussing in this video is the Marriott data breach. So in 2018, Marriott announced that there was a data breach within one of their subsidiaries called Starwood, and this ended up being a huge breach and a huge deal. So according to an article found in the Washington Post, this breach affected more than 500 million customers, and it showed records of when and where they were traveling. And then the information that was stolen included names, addresses, credit cards, and phone numbers, which is pretty typical of what hackers take when they steal information. But what was a little scarier in this case was the fact that they also stole more sensitive information, such as passport numbers, travel locations, and arrival and departure dates, which means they pretty much knew where these people were at all times because of the information they were able to gain access to. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what went wrong in the Marriott data breach. And like I said earlier, encryption plays a huge role in what went wrong in this situation. So, based on the same article that I mentioned earlier from the Washington Post, it appears that customer encryption keys may have been stolen prior to the breach, which obviously then would lead to the breach and would lead to hackers gaining access to information they weren't supposed to have access to. And the worst part is Marriott cannot say for sure if the keys had been stolen. They say maybe it could have been stolen, maybe they weren't, but there's no like definite answer. But it really does look like that the encryption keys were not secured properly by Marriott, which in turn led the hackers to gaining access to them and then getting the sensitive information about the customers. And Marriott really can't explain why the encryption keys weren't secured properly, so we may never really know what happened. So I talked a lot about the security issues that came along in these three breaches, but there was also privacy issues that came along with them. And the major privacy issue that stuck out to me is the fact that in all three of these cases there was an intrusion to the data of the company's users. And according to Joseph Kizza, intrusion is an invasion of privacy by wrongful entry, seizing or acquiring possession of the property of others. And hackers are a great example of this because whether or not they do anything with the data, they still break into the systems and access stuff without being authorized to and are still doing bad things. And like I said, all three breaches caused private personal information about users to be uncovered and stolen. The one thing I can say is in the Capital One case, Miss Thompson never did anything with that data. She just hacked it to prove that she could, but still it could have gone so badly if she had actually done something with the information she had gotten. This is my works cited with all my sources, and within this video I covered the three major breaches and the security and privacy issues that went along with them. What I found to be a little scary is the fact that these hackers got access to this information so easily because of holes in the security by these companies. It just shows that big corporations have to make sure that their security is foolproof in order to not only protect themselves, but protect the privacy of their users and help prevent data breaches like these from happening in the future.